And sorry, without sounding like a cinema, can I check everyone's phones are on silent, please, as well, or just like a snack pause? Well, hello everyone, and welcome to In-House for this Onward event. I'm Sebastian Payne, the director of Onward, and I'm delighted to be here for a great discussion on the home front. This event is taking together two of my favourite themes. One is levelling up, and the other is our manufacturing and science prowess, and how we can weave the two things together to try and improve resilience at home. I'm sure you've all followed the controversy about Newport Wafer Fab, which has shown the importance of having domestic manufacturing and engineering capabilities, both for trying to close regional inequalities and ensure our national security. So we're going to be looking at all these themes through this event this morning, and how we can shore up our domestic manufacturing capabilities, and that will flow into wider aims for the government. But I'm only here to chair. I'm joined by a fantastic panel who will be doing much of the speaking and have the much better thoughts than I do. On my right, we have Nusrat Ghani, who is the Minister for Industry at the Department for Business and Trade, relatively recently rebranded from BEIS.
Yes.
Exactly, it's hard to keep track with all the plaques around Whitehall. But Nuz has been in and out of government quite a lot over the past couple of years and is very much engaged in this agenda, and I know she's got a lot of thoughts to get on that. On my left, we have Julian Cracknell, who is the Chief Technology and Information Officer at BAE Systems, and Onward does a lot of collaborative work with BAE Systems, particularly with their sites in the northwest and around the UK, because they are very much invested in the levelling up agenda and, of course, manufacturing as well. On my left, we have Hayatan Salem, who is CEO of the Royal Academy of Engineering, who also chairs the government's Business Innovation Forum. So this is something where you get to look at these two elements together, manufacturing and innovation, which is a theme we're going to explore. And then finally, on my right, we have Verity Davidge, who is Director of Policy at Make UK, which is the UK's Manufacturers Association. Once again, much to explore in terms of how we knit levelling up and manufacturing together. So we're going to begin with some opening remarks from each of the panellists. We'll then have a discussion before throwing it out to you as well. So Nuz, would you like to begin with your thoughts?
Thank you, Sebastian. You aged me then by saying I've been in and out of government, so I'm not sure what to say next, to be honest. But I want to...
Much experience.
No, that's okay. Thank Julian for sponsoring the event, and it's great to be on a panel with Hayatan and Verity. And obviously I was a little bit overwhelmed by their brilliance, so I have spent the weekend reading, and I read a fantastic paper, Rust Belt on the Rhine, about the deindustrialisation of Germany. I'm just putting that out there because I know what Hayatan's going to criticise me for, so I can reflect on what's happening in Germany too. Look, there's been some global challenges, whether it's around energy costs or talent. Or fundamentally, what we want to achieve, everyone on this panel, is how we try and break the risk factor of adapting and adopting new technology, because if we get it right, then hopefully we can answer some of the challenges that we have in the UK, let alone in the rest of Europe as well. I am responsible for industry in the Department of Business and Trade, and that's everything from chemicals. Supply chains is one of my passions, and everything at the other end, whether it's the automotive, aviation or maritime sector. And over at the Cabinet Office, I take care of the investment security unit, which was with me at BEIS, so we've kind of done a few changes at the moment. So it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I look forward to the debate taking place, and manufacturing couldn't be any more important, but unfortunately it doesn't have that sexy cachet, so people don't talk about it until manufacturing dwindles and people's jobs are on the line. And for me it's very close to home. I grew up in Birmingham. Most of my family and my brother works at one of the car manufacturing plants in Solihull, so I know very well what it means when we have a blip in the supply chain or any loss of customer confidence to buy UK products. So it's manufacturing is absolutely critical, but more so, I would say, in our new passion for AI and technology. Because if we look across manufacturing, across all sectors, they're adopting technology at a different rate and different pace, and somehow we're going to have to bring them super fast up to speed, because we're never going to build as fast and cheap as China. But what we can do is adopt new tech to reduce our cost, to make ourselves more efficient, and obviously upskill and reskill as well. I do have a very short speech, only because we Googled what Verity and mostly Haidu may be saying, so I thought I'd put my rebuttals in first, if that's okay, Sebastian.
To hear a politician say we're going to have a very short speech is a rare thing.
I'm going to cut it back. It's going to cut it back. So the beauty is they want me to reference Margaret Thatcher, and who wouldn't, who herself recognised how important the sector was over 40 years ago, when she famously credited the Sea Harrier jump jet for helping Britain win the Falklands War. A brilliant feat of advanced manufacturing excellence that gave us the edge on the battlefield and helped us beat the odds far from home. And aircraft that was born of British innovation, built by British Aerospace and powered by Rolls-Royce Pegasus engines made in Bristol. And as we look ahead to the future of a fast-changing world, our sovereign manufacturing capabilities will become even more important than ever before in helping us to meet the challenges that we face. And not just in defence manufacturing, but across all the manufacturing sectors. And the sector is already a brilliant British success story worth over £220 billion to our economy. And what's important to the levelling up agenda, more than 80% of manufacturing is outside of London and the southeast. I'm a southeast MP, but I grew up in the Midlands, and I spent a lot of my time in Coventry, Warwick, Solihull, seeing all the fantastic jobs it's creating there. We know that it not only makes, but it creates, and it's basically, if we get the right ecosystem in place for the adoption of new tech, I'm sure it's going to enable us to reach the next stage of creating more jobs too. So it's very important to me and all of my portfolio, and fundamentally, if we don't have the critical minerals in place, we won't have the manufacturing numbers in place as well. If we don't adopt a new technology and de-risk, we're never going to deal with the challenges of products made cheaper elsewhere, let alone dealing with the impact on the environment. We have got a few examples of programs that we have been supporting. One is the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. There must be people in this room who work there. Thank you so much. And they receive core funding to help manufacturers take new technologies from drawing board to market. This is our version of sort of a Google Hub. We basically sponsor and help de-risk the most creative ideas that will obviously answer some of our solutions going forward. We have the Made Smarter, which I know that you guys will be at that board with me later on today. That's the UK's National Industrial Digitalisation Programme. It's £200 million, and it's committed to help manufacturers capitalise on new digital technologies, slash carbon emissions, and drive up productivity. And the curious thing is, when Made Smarter fell into my lap, I was aware of it, but I hadn't realised that some of the advice they have to give, especially the SMEs, we may seem as pretty mainstream, but it's remarkable how low-level technology still isn't being adopted by SMEs. They haven't got the time or the knowledge or the extra staff to adopt new tech to make it even smarter for them to manufacture where they are. Across other government departments, we've got support via the Energy Bills Discount Scheme. One of the major challenges for manufacturing has been the energy costs, and isn't it great today? We've got grant chaps all over the telly box talking about our great British nuclear programme. And of course, we've got Industrial Energy Transformation Fund too. We're doing our best to ramp up investment into renewable energies. And I must say that when I travel internationally, they do reflect on how forward-thinking we are in the UK. And obviously R&D spending, which has grown a huge amount and is now a huge passion for the PM and the Chancellor. So I would argue that compared to the rest of Europe, our R&D funding is pretty stellar. Huge amount of work's been taking place in offshore wind and hydrogen fuel innovation. I was over at Tilbury Port with the Lower Thames project, and we will be having, and I think it's one of the largest construction projects outside of HS2 in Europe, and it's going to be the first project that will be fundamentally hydrogen driven in a couple of years' time. Not just the vehicle movements on site doing construction, but vehicle movements coming on and off the site as well. We're leveraging billions of pounds of capital, private capital, to fuel growth and strengthen our energy security. It's a very attractive place to come and invest in the UK as well. We want to do everything we can to ensure that British manufacturers have access to raw materials and fundamentally raw critical materials too. And that requires a huge amount of technological progress to take place. I came back into government after having taken care of NATO Science and Tech Committee for 2 years, and we were fundamentally focused on critical minerals and security, whether it was maritime security or satellite security. And I wanted to refresh our critical mineral strategy, and I was lucky enough to come in and to be able to do that. It's so hard for ministers to get things done in a short period of time. So we've done something called the Critical Mineral Refresh, and that's me focusing on diversifying away from China, working with host countries, looking at refining, mining, processing and manufacturing, obviously to the highest ESG standards, but making sure supply chains are clean for my manufacturers and they're not just relying on one nation to get their key minerals from as well. We've also got the Automotive Transformation Fund. That is a pretty large fund that provides the most amount of money if you're going to be super innovative in any of the transport sectors. And that normally gives out funds to big firms like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, but I was quite keen to make sure that smaller firms were getting a look in, so we ensured that some of that funding went to 40 smaller firms as well. I was quite keen to make sure we were de-risking some of the challenges that they had. And we know that they're going to be part of our super competitive electric vehicle supply chain program of work. So doing my best not just to support the big ones but the small ones too, as well as diversifying from critical minerals from host countries and those nations that manufacture the products that we need. We have something called the Faraday Battery Challenge, which is going to be, I hope, groundbreaking in dealing with recycling of batteries too. Because if we can recycle 70% plus of lithium from a used battery, we could be, well, we need enough in the system, but we won't have to rely so much on sourcing them from base as well. Other departments are working on Destination Zero Aerospace, another area for our manufacturing firms to show the way, and that has a funding of £685 million of government funding. So I'm hoping that you can see that when we've got challenges of China and the deep pockets of IRA, we have to find the sweet spot, and we're never going to have pockets as deep as the USA. But if we are able to understand some of the challenges of our manufacturing firms, whether it's getting base products, dealing with people, dealing with energy costs, fundamentally being able to access money to de-risk some of the new innovative technology that they need to develop, but we could put ourselves in a really sweet spot here in the UK. I'm hoping that covers most of the issues that no doubt Verity and Haithoon are going to raise. But I just quickly want to reflect on this report, the deindustrialization of Germany. And it talks about the fact that they just weren't prepared to adopt new technology, especially when it came to electric vehicles. They couldn't let go of the combustion engine. They didn't spend enough time investing in EV. Then they were caught behind the curve when it came to China. And now obviously they're competing with IRA, and they're having to provide a huge amount of funding to keep what one would consider German firms in Germany, providing eye-watering sums of money. And there's one particular firm they've given a subsidy of about £10 billion. And fundamentally, that firm has pledged to create 3,000 jobs. That's 3.3 million for each of the 3,000 jobs that are going to be created. This is the situation that we're in now. We just cannot compete with that. And I'm hoping that between us and with the investments that we're making and the funds that we have in place, we can provide some of the technology which will answer some of the big challenges of manufacturing in the UK. I'll leave it there, Sebastian, as I'm worried I might speak over my allocated speaking slot.
Not at all. That was perfectly within the slot. Thank you very much, Ness. Julian, I'd like you to come in now to give you your reflections, both on what the Minister has said, but also from BAE Systems' perspective on how these two things link together, which is manufacturing, resilience and levelling up. It's three things, but it's just about right.
Fantastic opening comments. Thank you, Minister. I particularly like the story about the Sea Harrier and the contribution to the Falklands.
Was that BAE Systems by any chance?
Certainly involved in the mix there, yeah. I don't think the Sea Harrier is flying anymore. But I think if you look at the impact of Ukraine and the effect that has, and starting to think through how from a supply chain, from a manufacturing perspective, we respond to the challenges that are coming out of it, there are a number of important issues to think through, I think, and the Minister touched on a couple of them. Resilience in the supply chain, and the ability to scale and surge in terms of capacity. One of the interesting lessons coming from Ukraine when it was clear that there would need to be significant support to the Ukrainians was that governments around the world, Western governments around the world, essentially looked for, what equipment can you provide us? Looked to the industrial base and said, what can you give us? What can we provide? And the answer is essentially really nothing, because as an industry, we don't have stuff on the shelf waiting to go. Things tend to be produced in response to customer demand. And so that ability to surge has been very much a sort of two-handed relationship with government and industry working together. But I think as we look forward, thinking about that resilience and how we ensure that we can start to create that. And I think we'll probably see some of that coming out of the Defence Command paper later on today when it's published. Thinking about how we can work collectively between industry and government with a longer-term view about skills, about infrastructure that's required, about the supply chains that are required in order to be able to respond. And a lot of that is then placed out into, by placing it in industry, certainly on the manufacturing space. Much of that is outside of London, outside of the southeast. If I just look from a parochial BAE perspective, we contribute about £11 billion into the UK economy every year. much of which is being delivered in some of the most deprived regions of the UK. So submarine manufacture is being done in Barrow, employs 25% of the working age population in the town. We build F-35s, we build Typhoons in Wharton, again an area that in the northwest of the country that doesn't have many major employers, and this is a significant source of high skill, high tech, high income jobs. We build the Type 26 on the Clyde in Glasgow, again a huge source of income, and we support that out of Portsmouth, a very deprived community in places. So the contribution that manufacturing and engineering can make in terms of levelling up, I think is very significant. But that relationship between, certainly in the defence sector, between government and industry, in terms of forward planning, thinking about resilience, thinking about exports, maybe we'll pick that up later in the conversation, as a way of generating revenue for the UK economy, I think is a great, can be a great engine for success.
Thank you very much. Verity, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to speak on a panel who just talks about the wonders of manufacturing, because it makes my job a lot easier. And I think that, you know, we need to see our sector as a real success story in the UK. Sometimes it does feel like we have to sell it, but it should really sell itself. You know, a sector that stepped up during the pandemic, that provided critical PPE, that powered our homes with energy, that put food and drink on our table. And I think the fact that the government acknowledged that, and manufacturing was an industry that was able to stay open and operational, really kind of proved our value. And as an industry, we still kind of punch above our weight in a lot of ways. We're responsible for 2/5 of private R&D, 15% of total business investment, half of exports, and wages are actually 13% higher than the economy average. So again, it's just assumption we are a low-skilled, low-paying sector is completely the opposite of what we actually do. And the jobs that we are creating are those highly skilled, highly paid jobs in the regions that we want to level up. So in a way, we should just come from a point where we don't have to sell ourselves, even though we continue to do so. I think what else we learned during the pandemic was those kind of domestic capabilities that we have, but also some domestic vulnerabilities as well, and that need to build kind of resilience, and particularly supply chain resilience. We have a lot more to offer though. So over half of our members, half of manufacturers say that they could grow by another 20% in the next 5 years and simultaneously grow employment and those jobs if we have the right policy levers in place to do so. And I could give you a long list if you would like, but we'll save that for another day. But the kind of the gains and the opportunities, if we continue to grow our sector, are pretty huge. So if you were to grow manufacturing from 10 to 15%, you'd add 142 billion to the economy. And again, in those regions that we want to level up. Like I said, we could probably give kind of a long list of asks of what we could do to really boost the sector. But for us, it always kind of comes back to that long-term plan. Yeah. Call it whatever you want. We are strong advocates of an industrial strategy. Let's have no shame in using the word industrial. That's what do what it says on the tin. But having that kind of long-term plan is really what is missing. It gives that longevity, it gives that certainty, and that is what businesses need to make those investments. When we surveyed our members, 99% said they wanted an industrial strategy. Find the 1% that don't. It's just because they don't believe it will ever work in practice. I think the worrying point for me was when we found that half of companies don't feel like there's ever been a robust long-term vision for manufacturing, and in a way they felt that was really kind of holding them back in terms of growth. And if you look over at manufacturing over the past 10 years, and the Minister referred to kind of the GVA at the moment, last year it was about 206 billion. 10 years ago it was 170 billion. So it has increased, but its contribution to the overall economy is still 10%. So in a way, we haven't grown with the wider economy. So something is really still holding industry back. If you look at investment intentions, they've been prone to decline over the past decade. So investment intentions have actually turned negative 10 times the last 10 years. 6 of those times have been the last 5 years. That's capturing our exit from the EU and the pandemic. So those kind of two big factors have played a massive part. And in terms of employment intentions, we haven't quite met them because of the labour shortage, which is still the biggest issue at the moment for manufacturers. We have had a skills crisis for decades, But what we're now seeing is a labour shortage where we simply can't get bodies. So at the moment, we're about 74,000 live vacancies. If you look at lost kind of productivity or output, that's about 6 billion a year. So that's the reason why we really want, government, and in particular Treasury, because they're the ones that hold the purse strings for all these things, to really take some action, because you're losing money, you're losing output to our economy. We have seen great support for the sector at the moment. The Chancellor has picked advanced manufacturing as a strategic growth sector. That's great news for us. We look forward to seeing what he's going to do with that. I think that there's a question mark about how we're defining advanced manufacturing.
Yeah.
It's a big one. Arguably everything could be advanced if actually we pulled the right policy levers, and what we don't want to do is create a big lag between those that are kind of at the top and those that are moving behind. But we've seen, policies on increasing labour market participation, full expensing, annual investment allowance, all of these are great, but what we still need is that long-term vision and plan. If we asked the great British public, I would call them, where they thought manufacturing was in the UK was in terms of manufacturing in the world, and they put us at 56th. We're actually 9th. If you want to know, 56th is Kazakhstan. Lovely little bit of trivia for you. But we're the 9th manufacturing nation in the world. That's something we should be really proud of. But an ambition would be go from the top 10 to the top 5, and let's even hit the top spot. But we can only do that, and we can only kind of battle what we're seeing in the US and in the EU with that long-term plan. So that's really our ask from us.
Great. Well, that's a very nice note of optimism. To Haytham, would you like to end us up with your opening remarks?
Thank you very much indeed, and delighted to be here on this panel. So I also think when you're trying to reflect on where you want to get to, you should just make sure you know where we are today. And fortunately, the Royal Academy of Engineering has just published a piece of work which provides a comprehensive overview of the UK's engineering economy. And what you see is that engineering is everywhere and it's nowhere the same. So representing 26% of jobs nationally, engineering can't be overlooked in any particular area of the UK. It makes up 11% of employment in all local authorities, at least that much, ours of Scilly being the smallest, in case you're interested, and 50% at the highest, which is in Copeland in Cumbria. And I think as the panel have already reflected, you don't see the same extreme north-south divide as you might do if you looked at something like GVA specifically. So we've got obviously big strengths in London and South East, but also strengths in the Midlands, in Cheshire, in South Derbyshire, in Flintshire. It's quite widely distributed. And some clues as to where could we do better in terms of capturing value from our engineering strengths. I think, we're all familiar with this idea that there's a halo effect around a city centre. City centre is obviously often the location for those high R&D intensive jobs. And some areas do very well in making sure that flows into benefits in a sort of thriving industrial halo around the city centre, other areas less so. And a second opportunity that I think we can do better on is maximising the potential of quite specialised industrial clusters. I'm sure, again, people across this panel and in the audience will be familiar with the idea that your industrial heritage continues to shape what you do today to some extent. I think it's brilliant that Cheshire's strengths in life sciences and chemical industries can be traced all the way back to being involved in salt production in Roman times. But sometimes we're not doing enough to make sure that the sort of structurally weaker economy around those industrial and engineering manufacturing strengths is addressed in a way that will deliver greater benefit to the local region. The second point I want to make is that it's inevitable that when we talk about levelling up, we like to look at where the funding is flowing. But actually what's more important is that we keep our eye on the prize, which is what are the outcomes? Who's feeling the benefits from these investments that we make? So I sit on the Levelling Up Advisory Council, and one of the areas of work that we're doing at the moment is focused on R&D and innovation. So I'm very pleased to be leading a workstream for the Advisory Council with Catherine Bennett from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. And so what you see there is that we have the R&D mission in the Levelling Up White Paper. That's incredibly valuable. It provides a real hook for driving progress and accountability across government. But actually, what we're doing is trying to say, how do we make sure that investments in research and innovation, no matter where they are, deliver greater benefit to people in areas where historically that hasn't been the case? And one of the things that we need to bear in mind alongside all of that is the pace of technological change. technology change is non-linear and it never ends. So I think, our obsession with generative AI has actually helped really bring into sharp focus people that this is here today and it's changing everything. But of course, it goes much deeper than that. And I think we have a real risk that if we are not smart about the way we respond to that, we just increase inequality. We increase the gap between the leading edge, those who are innovating, driving that forefront of technological change, and those that don't have the capacity to understand even how to adopt, as the Minister said. And I'm really pleased you did mention adoption of technology and innovation, Minister. I think it's such an important area that the UK has not given us sufficient attention to in the past. So we'd love to see more focus on that. And bearing in mind in particular that parts of the UK which depend on manufacturing that is less at the very leading edge of advanced manufacturing and more around production, sort of practical engineering jobs, those are most at risk of automation. So it's a real watch point. So my final cluster of points I just wanted to make are around the value in taking a systems view in this area. We've talked about manufacturing and engineering, resilience, levelling up. How do you bring all those together through systems approaches? And actually, I think the strategic advantage agenda that government has increasingly been framing a lot of this discussion in terms of is very helpful here. So that posits that to achieve the benefits that we anticipate from strengthening science and technology, you need to focus on having the right quality of leadership. You need to focus on that plan that Verity talked about, whatever you call it, that long-term plan, which involves making choices and involves sustained action and involves partnerships with key stakeholders. That's a very, very valuable lens for thinking about how you square off all those different priorities that we're talking about here. And I think that place-based investment can actually be a very helpful way of getting that integration point between different government priorities, from national security to net zero to levelling up. If you're going to make investments in semiconductors because you recognise that's important for national security and economic prosperity, why wouldn't you take into account the opportunity to deliver levelling up benefits? If we know that offshore renewables are going to be very important to our march to net zero, why wouldn't you think about investing in skills bases in places where there are coastal communities that desperately need of regeneration? And it's very important that systems view encompasses skills. We have obviously a very long-standing shortfall in skills and diversity, I will say it out loud, in engineering, manufacturing. And this is, as we think about a changing skills landscape, that's a great opportunity to bring different people into our workforce. Minister Ghani quite rightly pointed out upskilling and reskilling as being a key tool that we have available to us, but also supply chains too. And thinking about what it means in terms of something like quantum. What are the skills we're going to need to not just develop quantum technologies, but apply them across our industrial base? The very process of manufacturing quantum kit, that's innovation in itself. Have we given enough thought to what the infrastructure and the supply chains are going to look like in order to make sure the UK can occupy the place we wanted to in the global value chain? And then finally, I am a big fan of, alongside looking at the local perspective on this, complementing that by thinking about how you connect that to the national view. Because at the end of the day, we have to market the whole UK offer more effectively. The UK is an innovation supercluster. I've said it on this stage before. It's still true. Our approach to clusters is very granular. We're, in the US, a single cluster would involve UK, Birmingham, probably Manchester. We're very, very granular. We need to be careful of the risks of hyper-localization, because we then don't have critical mass, and then we can't also tell that rounded, joined-up story about the UK offer. Because at the end of the day, we might have a huge amount going on, but we can't expect the rest of the world to know about that. So telling that story better, I think, is a real compliment to everything my colleagues have said already.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm just going to throw a couple of questions straight to the Minister. I think you might have to dash off at some point.
Only because I have to be in the chamber. There's no other reason.
Oh, right, no, not important at all. But one thing that I think's come up, from the discussions is the international element to it. So I think you mentioned the IRA, which is something that I think occupies a lot of thoughts in the Treasury, but also in your department as well. And the UK does risk getting trapped in this subsidies race, particularly with manufacturing, when you've got America pumping money in on one side, and as you said, the low-cost base that China has on the other. Where do you go to remain relevant and go up from 9th higher up that list? Because it does seem, if not quite impossible, very, very difficult.
It does, but we do have a unique ecosystem in the UK, and we've got some fantastic companies and manufacturing sites that everybody else wants to come and visit. Mostly it's to see how we do things so they can do them just as well or even better. So we've got a huge amount of talent, which I would argue potentially the USA is trying to get hold of, but still doesn't have at the moment. Our IRA is deep, and it's been huge. I mean, it's great that they've finally decided, the Americans, to deal with the issue around the environment and how they deal with dealing with how they have their targets in place for zero emissions. But I don't think even they were aware how disruptive it was going to be to the manufacturing sector, which is international. You have companies that are have European headquarters in the States, and headquarters in Asia, and many of them are having to make decisions where they want to invest going forward. Do they continue in Europe and Asia, or do they now just divest and move over to the USA? So it's been very disruptive. It also means it's moving the supply chain, which was already facing one part of the world, now being forced to face another part of the world. So I see it as an opportunity. So where we have our expertise in the UK, and we have a huge amount of expertise when it comes to critical minerals in particular, they will need us to work with them to get hold of those minerals. We have the relationships with a number of host countries. We've got the expertise and the academic knowledge and the fantastic firms, often quite small firms, that can enable critical minerals to be managed in a much more ESG fashion, which is great for the customer and the shareholder. They'll need us for that as well, fundamentally. And they have another challenge which we're dealing with, as the rest of Europe, is talent and people. They may have very deep pockets and huge commitments to throw up factories left, right and centre, but who's going to be in there doing the work that needs to be done? And are they still going to be brave and bold enough to adopt AI and new technology to be as innovative as they can be? But if we are in the UK, possibly on a smaller scale, we can have the wins on a much greater scale than potentially that they have in the United States. I spent a lot of time talking to my American counterparts. They were trying to deal with domestic issues, but also to deal with China. We've got to manage that relationship in our own way. My job is to give confidence to manufacturers who have international CEOs to continue to invest and grow in the UK. And you've talked about some of the challenges, as did Julian. Energy costs was one. Second is making it not only efficient tax-wise, but enabling them to be able to recruit and gain further investment and expand in the UK. There's nothing worse than having to expand elsewhere overseas. And one thing we haven't spoken about, because it doesn't seem very sexy, is dealing with regulation. If we can deregulate more, makes it easy to do business, which makes it much easier to try and explain why you want to continue investing in the UK versus Germany or the United States. I'm pleased we're all on this net zero journey. I'm pleased that we've now finally understood that we have to diversify our critical minerals. I'm pleased that we finally understand how dynamic the advanced manufacturing sector is, but we need to encourage and provide some support in them adopting new tech, because we're not going to deal with the other challenges that we have.
And then just last, very briefly, something that's been picked up, I think, by all panel members is skilling, and particularly upskilling in this agenda as well. And we did a recent event with the Education Secretary at BA System in the Northwest as well. And, trying to crack that technical education thing is something we've tried consistently in about 15 different ways since the Second World War, and have not quite got there. And it feels like that is also going to be a really big gap in this as well, because we can see the opportunities, for investment in many of these places that need levelling up, but if they don't have the skills base, then it's just simply not going to happen.
Which is why the apprenticeship push that's coming from our Secretary of State for Education is absolutely key. And Khaitun and I met many years ago. This is how old we both are, when I was in a different minister. But my job was to lead the Year of Engineering, and that year we reached out to 1 million young people and their parents, just to encourage them to think about taking STEM subjects and think about being in this space. And the most heartbreaking stories, they have no idea what it's like working in advanced manufacturing. They think it's cumbersome, masculine, and just old-fashioned. They have no idea that actually it's a very creative. Once you've skilled up, you can end up working in so many sectors all over the world. So dealing with people when they're young, making sure there are options to become an apprentice, not do a main academic degree, is key. But I'm going to go back to the AI and tech, because I keep reading more and more when you're dealing with really progressive governors in states in the USA, what's happening over in Asia in particular. If we can help industry to adopt technology, which is good for government, and good for government means they continue to recruit and reskill and upskill people. If we can be a part of that conversation with them, we should be able to crack the nut of how do we deal with a small group of people in a sector and making sure they continue to have jobs as the sector advances going forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Minister. Now, do you need to dash off?
And I've got 10 more minutes.
Oh, 10 more minutes.
listen,
Brilliant.
no,
Okay,
that's all
right. Excellent. Well, I've got a couple more questions. Should we go to the audience, or should we go? I've got a couple. I'm going to come to Julian first, and then we'll throw out the audience very briefly and make sure you've got time to ask Minister the questions. One thing, Julian, I think we have to think about in this was the context of the Ukraine conflict as well, because that's obviously disrupted supply chains and manufacture, had a really big focus on resilience at home here. And I know this is something that BA does a lot of work on. So what are your learnings from that and where we need to focus on?
Well, I think we've touched on the panel on energy security has been clearly a significant issue. As I mentioned earlier on, I think this issue of resilience from the perspective of whether you have a supply chain that is capable of surging capacity, responding to changes in demand, and that's quite difficult to build up in the short term. It needs to be designed in over with a longer term view. Inevitably, industry responds to the stimulus that it's given by government, and if that focus is about limited capacity, just in time, lowest possible cost, the supply chain gets constructed around that stimulus. And when you then want to change that dynamic and say, actually, we need to double the amount of, let's say, artillery shells, that's been a really significant issue coming out of Ukraine. The volume that are being consumed by both sides has been enormous, way in excess of, I think, what anyone predicted. And so the ability of the supply chain then to respond to that and to scale up its production, it will take years. And I think, therefore, there is a more mature relationship between government and industry to think about where will we need that sort of resilience in the future, and how do we design that in now in anticipation of those potential future changes. And that's not just about prime contractors like BAE, it's about the 6,000 SMEs that we work with throughout the supply chain and the skills and experience that they bear. The other point I would make is around sovereignty, and I think the Minister touched on it earlier on, but as a nation, thinking about the areas in our, certainly defence manufacturing capability, where it is important that we have control, have freedom of movement, freedom of action, and the freedom to modify things in our own interest, which gives us much more scope to then create products that are capable of export, again, a great generator of revenue for the UK economy.
And I'm going to very quickly just come back on one last point there, because you talked about exports in your opening remarks as well. But I would be interested in your thoughts on this international element, because as Hayton was saying, the UK's version of a cluster is very different from other countries and other international countries. And there is a question here about scale and about how we can better collaborate to compete internationally in terms of manufacturing capabilities.
So I'd say there are two really significant examples in the defence sector of international collaboration, which I think are going to be transformative for us over the next few years. The first is GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme, which is the creation of a sixth generation combat air fighter, which is a joint collaboration between the UK government, the Japanese government and the Italian government, with industry in all three countries working together to deliver that. That's going to create many tens of thousands of really cutting edge jobs, not just in terms of jobs, but the technology, as the Minister was saying, that's used to support the manufacture, but will drive really significant future exports for the UK. The other really exciting example is AUKUS and this relationship between the UK, the US and Australia in terms of new submarines. That is going to generate tens of thousands of jobs in the UK and Australia and the US. And a bit driven by the skills, or not driven by, but in responding to the skills challenge, by coordinating demand from three countries and trying to satisfy that in a global way, rather than each individual country trying to work out how it can generate the right skills and the right workforce, should allow us to be able to respond to future changes and bring in more technology. But I think we'll have to see how that plays out.
You wanted to cover
Just a very brief additional point around the capability that underpins our resilience and security. I think there's a very intimate relationship between manufacturing and technology and innovation, and it's also going to be important to be clearer about which are the areas of of earlier stage research and capability that we think are going to be necessary from a national security point of view. And the UK has tended to be a bit reluctant to do that. But we're now in a much more complex environment. Ms. Sagani has been ahead of the curve in terms of highlighting risks of working with China, and the ISC report, I think, provides some very serious questions for the research community, which is maybe less comfortable and experienced at understanding how to navigate national security concerns. A trusted research agenda is still quite early. So I think there's work to do on that side as well.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Verity, I want to just go to the audience here. Any questions for the minister? So keep coming back, I guess. Everyone, any questions for the minister before she's to go? Yes, I've got two in the front row here. I've got a microphone. If you could just say who you are and where you're from. Thank you.
Joe Dancy from Endeavour Advisory. I work with companies, often industrial companies in the northeast of England. Redcar is a good example of a place where Bayes and government has invested in research on steel and critical materials going forward. But I was going to ask about this narrative. I think it's very important about how it comes across, and I think there seems to be a sort of ideological and feeling of experience approach to how people approach a sort of negativity to manufacturing. I find it terribly depressing a few years ago on the Today programme to hear the Adam Smith Institute describing ceramics as crappy manufacturing, crappy British manufacturing was the quote. But then you look at somebody like Nick Macpherson from the Treasury, or formerly of the Treasury, now of the banking world, who sort of takes a very negative view about how far British industry can go compared, talks about the 70s a lot. So I wondered, is this problem of narrative, is it more ideological, is it more feeling of negative experience, and how we might change that, frankly?
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caroline Kehan. I work for the Food and Drink Federation, and we represent food and drink manufacturers, the largest manufacturing sector in the UK. I have to have a shout out for that. Really support all of the comments around skills, net zero, all of the challenges that manufacturing face, but we also feel that food and drink manufacturing in particular has a real significant potential around adopting new technologies, upskilling our people, exporting more in food and drink around the globe. My question was really sort of building on your point, Verity, around this definition of advanced manufacturing. We are really keen as an industry to work with government on these issues. And it's just, sort of this, what do we mean by advanced manufacturing? We definitely believe that we are advanced manufacturers, but it's just, it feels even across government, there seems to be slight difference in opinion, and I would just like some clarity around that.
Thank you very much. Was there any? Let's get to one more here from this gentleman.
Thank you, Jack Semple is my name. I'm Secretary of the Engineering and Machinery Alliance of Trade Associations. Completely agree with the points about advanced manufacturing. I think we need to get away from that term as a group of subsectors which have not been identified by the Treasury. The Treasury values it at 93 billion, which is less than half of the manufacturing sector. Yeah. And we need to talk about manufacturing as the sector, and advanced is the aspiration for that sector. If you've got a meeting this afternoon with Made Smarter,
I have.
Can we please have a national, long-term, coherent plan to drive adoption of innovation, which the British Business Bank has very helpfully identified as being really important. And within that, as we've just heard from a couple of trade associations, can I emphasise how important trade associations can be in communicating that message?
Thank you very much. Right, do you want to take those three then? So we've got the narrative and the way we talk about manufacturing. You would never hear a think tank like Onward talking in those kind of terms. The definition of advanced manufacturing, and then also a long-term coherent plan on innovation.
Well, the last speaker, forgive me, your name? Jack, but you answer the middle question, which is the Treasury, the Treasury, which is an issue. I mean, I work very closely with your organisation. I was at your event in Westminster just last week, if I had my way. Food and drink, considering how large it is in the sector, and how, if you went along and saw how these sites are managed, there's nothing for you to agree to other than they are advanced. So it's an ongoing challenge that I'm raising with the Treasury. The plan is a difficult question for me to ask. When I first became a minister and I was at the dispatch box defending government lines, the opposition who were on the Bay Select Committee with me started waving my own reports in my face, and life came at me very fast, because I often argued that we needed a long-term strategy, just for people to establish where we thought the greatest opportunities were, and where we thought we'd de-risk it, and where we thought the support would be available. And if you look at all the things that we are doing, it is components of a plan. What we haven't done is called it a plan or then given it a narrative, which is why I've been working with the officials in BASE, who are now in business and trade, working on an advanced manufacturing plan. We're working with the Treasury to try and get that out there as soon as that is possible. I want to be able to talk about, there are so many different elements of support, so many good stories, so many challenges, but we just need to wrap them up together, whether it's national or regional, to provide confidence to the sector that we've got their back and we've got some plans in trying to deal with some of the challenges that they face. So it's one of the things I definitely want to do on my watch, mostly because I banged on about it for 2 years on the Base Select Committee, so that would be incredibly difficult. And going back to the first question, which is all wrapped up in all of them, people have no idea what advanced manufacturing is. The two people that you mentioned, maybe they were born in a very different generation to myself, or they had a very different experience. I've never seen anything as exciting being on the shop floor in some of our major industries. They are dynamic, they're using great tech, they're thinking about the health and welfare of their employees, know what the challenges are overseas, desperate to drive down costs, desperate to limit the time it takes to make a product, and also manage an impact on their environment. These are good people doing everything that we need them to do, not just for our voters, the customer, but for their shareholders as well. But we do look at it at Prism that somehow we're entering a space that's going to be old-fashioned, dirty and murky. No one's going to understand the language that we are using, which is why when we had Tech Week a few weeks ago that the PM had, I was desperate to make sure that we had a sideline of events that dealt with my sector. I'm hoping that next time that my sector can be front of centre of any AI Tech Week, because you haven't got to go anywhere else and see that the work that they are doing. So it is a challenge. I'm not sure why, considering how easy it is to go into one of these places, and most people will know how their products are manufactured. You can see it on YouTube. I don't know why we still have this old-fashioned view. But my portfolio covers 52% of all jobs in the UK. Now, if I want that number to grow, we're going to have to make sure people understand how innovative the sector is, and how we can encourage it to become even more dynamic going forward. That's the only way we're going to deal with the issues that Haythun raised, which is how do we get more people thinking this is a career worth investing the time in.
And just Verity, do you want to come in on this point as well? Because this is sort of literally your job in many respects to try and sell this narrative. But you can see that point because, in a way, advanced manufacturing sounds different, interesting, innovative towards traditional manufacturing. I guess there's a bridge between those two.
There is, but I think that actually when I go out and visit a lot of manufacturing, I couldn't tell you if it was advanced or not, because what you assume it to perhaps be, and actually what you see in action, use of robotics, cobotics, machine learning, AI, that is becoming the norm. It's not just in the kind of largest, biggest brands, OEMs. It's everywhere. It's among our SMEs. I think in a way, one, let's shut down the people that just talk in crappy, ceramics. Just turn it off. And then two, almost we need to stop talking about it being a negative perception. So we've just resurveyed the public again, just to see their thoughts. And actually, it's perhaps not as bad as we think. The public are now beginning to see manufacturing as solutions focused and thinking about being the solver to kind of the climate change crisis. So we've actually done a lot of good work. And what we need to now do is just all be talking about it in more of a positive light. We've had Tech Week and others. On the 28th of September, we have National Manufacturing Day. We call on all of our members. Yeah, just one day. It's really hard to look down ministers for even a day. But just a day, just designated to just throw open your doors, invite young people, invite local communities, and just show them what we have to offer. And we've got hundreds of companies, signed up. We have got ministers and MPs involved, and just, we need to showcase what we do a lot more, because actually, once you go and see inside, you never want to leave.
Sebastian, can I just add, because this is a triggering topic for me, that this manufacturing services adversarial debate that pits one against the other. Can't you use your influence to help us move on from this? Because if you think about it, show me a part of services that isn't entirely dependent on hardware. How many manufacturers are making their money through business models that are based around servitization? There are so many things that are wrong with this outdated view of caricaturing the British economy. Can't you help us, Sebastian?
Okay, well,
Leave it at
knew
that.
this would come back to me somehow. But then I think there is a way about that, obviously because manufacturing has changed in terms of the services, there is a way they are sort of constantly sort of pitted against each other, one reason or another.
Now that you're left holding the baton,
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just going to leave there.
Yes.
But thank you so much. Thank you
very much. Let's take another final round of questions before we wrap up. Who have we got? We've got, yes, these two gentlemen here.
Thanks. So I'm just a member of the public. I work in banking as a job, but just a member of the public in general. Just my general question is on, great from a member of the public sort of point of view, seeing sort of British Volt and Arrival. I know Arrival is going to maybe go to America or might have a problem sort of getting started, and they look like really great tech at the time and great bits of manufacturing at the time. I'm just wondering what the panel feel about the ecosystem for startups to scale up for great new techs that we seem to be able to come up with great tech, we just don't seem to be able to sell it. So just wanted your comments on that.
Thank you. And a gentleman here.
I'm Ross Moody from the Centre for Progressive Policy at the Red Economic Think Tank. I'm really interested in this industrial halo sort of clusters idea, and obviously the government recently announced the investment zone scheme. I think it's 12 investment zones, and I think the first actual what it's going to be investment zone got announced recently. South Yorkshire is going to be an advanced manufacturing. But one of the things I'm interested in is obviously yet to be determined where it will be, but it will be based around a university, city region economic model, largely based in cities. But we recently did a piece of work this year looking at sort of mapping in manufacturing and other sectors found there's a lot in towns which sort of surround these areas. So I suppose the question I'm trying to get at is how do you sort of leverage something like investment zones to sort of bring the sort of surrounding town, potentially rural manufacturing basis. How do you get them to benefit from that? And I suppose the sort of follow-up question to that is if you can't do that and if that is really focused on city region, that type of growth, is there a different sort of policy solution or policy offer that you might need for sort of manufacturing in towns and more peripheral, more rural areas?
Thank you very much. Two very good questions. Do you want to take this on, Julian, about industrial zones and manufacturing in towns as well? Because again, thinking about the different sites of BAS across the country, that's something I think where you have focused quite well on trying to develop those areas of speciality. But that does come with the skills challenge we were talking about, the investment challenge, and obviously the whole ecosystem around that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can necessarily talk to towns versus cities necessarily, but if I just talk about one of the examples of where we worked with the local community. So we built submarines at Barrow. We've done that. There was a comment earlier on about the sort of the heritage of manufacturing, how that flows through. We've been doing that for more than 100 years, and it is a significant part of the town. There will be a really significant scale up in manufacturing in Barrow over the next few years, and they've gone from of the order of 5,000 employees to now 10,000. That'll go up to about 17,000 over the next few years, as well as the similar growth in Australia as well. The impact that has on a local community in terms of jobs, yes, but also what does that mean for local infrastructure? Literally roads, railways, bridges, significant discussion about a particular bridge and how that constrains travel in the region. What does that mean from an education perspective? We play a significant role in the local education academies because we are creating the employees of the future, and we have to make sure that the right skills are there, particularly in the STEM skills. And so trying to take, the third point I was going to make is around the creation of spin-off supporting SMEs. There is a huge supply chain of small organisations that are a part of that manufacture, many of which are based in that region, which has few other significant employers. So it is much greater. I think the sort of flywheel effect that manufacturing can have on a community is enormous, but it does take then a joined-up approach from government across a whole range of different departments, working with large organisations like us as well as smaller employers, and things like investments. I think it can be a significant driver of that, but it doesn't come for free. There is real concerted effort that's required over a long term to generate the right conditions.
And Hayton, do you want to come on this point about the ecosystem as well? Because you mentioned obviously British Volt, which I think is the most notable example of trying to plough towards something new and fresh and all collapsed. And we could spend a whole panel talking about what happened with British Volt. We won't do that. But this issue about scaling up an ecosystem, we've done work on this at Onward, and we've got more work later in the year coming out about, I guess, the D and R&D, that we're very good at research and ideas. We're good when we've got established companies, but it's that middle bit there.
Absolutely, and so we've got, I guess, a sort of living lab of startup to scale up experience, and that the Academy has supported 350 entrepreneurs so far that all have their roots in engineering technology-based businesses. So I guess if you were to try and segment it into the key issues, you'd say we have brilliant creative minds, but not always investment-ready propositions. So accelerators like our Enterprise Hub are routes to making sure that people who have the kind of the technology push also learn much more about customer pull and business models and all of that. And actually the UK ecosystem has matured a lot in that. I'm delighted now there's this thing called deep tech, hard tech. Didn't exist. We were just a sort of unattractive bit of investment that was really expensive and long term when we started. Second is availability of capital. That's obviously key. Patient capital, where you have investors who've got the sophistication to analyse these deep tech, hard tech propositions and understand how to appraise them properly. We've definitely seen a bit of a shift, and there's obviously some recent announcements around pension funds. I think they're very promising, but we have a much less mature investment market than the US in that regard. And the third is the availability of critical mass of talent pools, right? So the Silicon Valley model relies so much on the fact that you've got people who go into one business, that business contracts, they're let go, but they stay in their talent pool, that talent circulation piece. And I think that's something that we need to work harder at, particularly in the context of levelling up. It happens to some extent in London and in Cambridge, but there's an opportunity to get better at that more broadly. And then if I can very quickly just comment on investment zones, I think there are a couple of things that we can definitely try to do in that context that will help almost whatever the existing capability. One is getting that alignment of actors and levers so that we get better value out of the collective efforts that people are making. Secondly, that we get smarter at using these focal points to attract private sector investment, particularly inward investment. And I would love to see us doing more things like having concierge services within particular regions, which make it super easy for business to navigate the whole of government offer, which is currently not one of the UK strengths, and we've done work to show that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Verity, you just want to come in on the industrial zones point.
Yeah, no, almost a kind of, startup to scale up point, which I think sometimes is, when we're talking about manufacturing engineering, we forget about. We're so focused particularly on large companies and SMEs that we forget about the kind of potentials for, for startups. And it is almost creating that, back to that right business environment. Interestingly, our recent survey work showed that manufacturers feel that the UK is no longer really a competitive place to do manufacturing. The first time we've probably seen that in kind of 5 to 10 years, and it's even worse if it's foreign-owned, they're foreign-owned companies. And it is making sure we have that right, regulatory environment around us. The Minister talked about deregulation, smarter regulation. It also sounds great. We've got to be careful about to what extent we use a sledgehammer to cut maybe an unnecessary nut in some instances. Access to that talent pool. When we talk about digital adoption and increasing that, it's great. If we've got a labour shortage, automate. But if you automate with a robot, you need a robotics engineer to service it. That's even a harder skill to find than someone who was doing that task to begin with. So we can't do one without the other, and that's again why we always say we need that longer term kind of cross-department coherent plan. And I think the other thing specifically for manufacturing engineering companies is also if they're looking to expand kind of physical infrastructure, and you actually might need access to ports. You need different things that actually aren't always easy as just we're going to expand tomorrow. The people element, the infrastructure, the regulation, the regulatory environment, and that's why we need to kind of take a really broad brush approach to, if we're going to really promote manufacturing as a lever for economic growth, do we have the right framework in place? And at the moment it feels like we're not quite there yet.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to take any 2 last quick questions before we wrap up. Yes, so we've got one at the back and one here. If we just keep them short, please.
Hi, Aaron Revel from World Skills UK. We published a report recently with BAE Systems actually, which really spoke to that need to create a compelling narrative around manufacturing careers, because there's negative perceptions, particularly amongst young women, do persist. It also showed the needs for definitely for manufacturers to invest more in the skills of their workforce. But I actually wanted to ask a question around the FE workforce, and something that we commonly hear from the colleges and other institutions we work with is their inability to compete with industry for wages and losing members of staff. And whilst the sector is probably, it's fair to say, been historically under-resourced, I don't think it's ever going to be able to compete with industry for wages, however much money you give the FE sector. So how do we sort of enable colleges to in-house sort of up-to-date industry standard skills, which they can then use to equip the next generation coming through with the skills that they need?
Thank you. And there's the gentleman behind there.
Hi, my name's Chris Baker. I work for an organisation called Studios Owl. We are an innovation organisation. Just to quickly get to the point, really, and actually building on the conversation that was just had around the ecosystem, the collaboration opportunities. There's obviously a lot of conversation about skills, and often that means technical skills and how we bring the hard skills to the next generation of workers and indeed the current generation. But in order to grow as a business, and that was a conversation just being had with startups and scale-ups, you've also got skills around being able to identify opportunities, actually validate those ideas, make sure you feel comfortable taking the next step that will then grow and allow you to hire that next person, particularly in the smaller organisations. So I just wondered, maybe just to build on what you're saying there, what can be done or what more can be done to build those skills quite directly by large organisations and by the public sector and other groups to really focus in on that and perhaps get some quick wins as well as some of that longer term stuff that will come through in the next 10 years.
Thank you very much. Well, those questions very helpfully knit together very well. So I'm just going to come to each of the panel members, their thoughts very briefly before we wrap up. Julian.
I think the point about further education workforce, yes, I can see that sort of balance of the pay between different sectors is always going to exist, and there are always going to be sort of osmotic pull that drives people between different sectors. I think there is a responsibility for industry to work with academia and other further education providers, and certainly it's something that we would do, both to generate research, but also to generate jobs and skills, knowing that there are, if you look at our future manufacturing model, and much of that is coming out of academia, and we're working hand in hand to think about how we can then industrialise their original ideas. So I think the pressure is always going to be there, but there is a responsibility to keep working with academia. On the non-tech skills, again, I think there's a responsibility on industry to help SMEs and startups to think about that scale-up problem. Now, we're not going to do that for entirely altruistic reasons. It's clearly focused on areas where we can see that there are opportunities or technologies that we might be able to make use of. But there is a sort of ability to support some great ideas and think about how do you take those to market, what does the business model look like, what does your business development look like, which we can do for areas that are of interest.
Thank you. Verity?
Yeah, I guess I completely agree on the FE point. I hear stories of first-year apprentices being taught by third-year apprentices because there's simply not enough FE tutors. I think one avenue is, of course, seconding industry into FE, and I think that needs to be a two-way street. I actually think it'd be no bad thing for FE to be seconded into industry simultaneously to understand the expectations, because from industry's perspective, they always feel FE's maybe perhaps lagging a little bit. So that two-way secondment, and then the other thing I think maybe a missed opportunity from this spring budget and the labour market participation piece is for all of those over 50s who apparently retired to live in the Cotswolds post-pandemic. Are those potentially those who used to work in manufacturing that might actually come back and even give something back in terms of going back into FE, and perhaps wouldn't demand the high wages in comparison to industry? Probably have to do all of that stuff around pensions, etc. But actually that for me was always a missed opportunity, and if we still have that potential problem about or over 50s that have left the workplace earlier, maybe now cost of living crisis, if they can come back in, why don't we entice them to actually work back in the FE sector as opposed to go back to industry?
Excellent. Fine.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree about the value that comes from mobility, increasing mobility between sectors. And the Academy has spent a lot of time moving people between industry and academia. And increasingly we're trying to do that in an FE context too, as well as giving people who've come out of FE routes, vocational routes, the opportunity to build their entrepreneurial skills so they can go and be part of that entrepreneurial ecosystem. We need mobility in all directions. Everybody wins. And then also to say we shouldn't underestimate that the size and scale of this kind of societal shift we need to go through now around upskilling and reskilling This is huge. So there are things that you can do, but I don't know that there are quick wins. And, it's everything from how can we improve signposting? If you know you want to upskill or reskill, or you're a business that wants to invest, where do you go to get impartial expert advice that tells you which courses to go to? How do you do quality control around the myriad of skills offers out there? What about micro-credentialing in terms of professional registration, all the rest of it? I mean, there's so many layers to this. So we shouldn't feel overwhelmed, but it is a big collective challenge. And then finally, just shout out, if you don't mind, to This Is Engineering, our campaign to reposition engineering and including manufacturing in the minds of young people. Open source campaign, lots of open access materials if you want to go look them up. Thank you very much.
No, great. Well, thanks for that mad dash there, but we got there in the end. It's been a really, really interesting panel, and I think one thing that's good is to hear the kind of there's so many key themes here in terms of trying to make sure, particularly on skills, particularly on the ecosystem, and a lot of narrative and language about this here. But clearly, I think what we've all agreed on is that levelling up and manufacturing do go very well together. It's about how we talk about and how we create the regulation, Minister is here, ecosystem to make sure that we can make the most of that. And hopefully the government gets that when they're thinking about that long-term coherent plan that we're all looking forward to. But thank you very much to everyone in the room for coming, for your brilliant questions. But above all, thanks in absentia to Nuss, to Verity, to Hyton and Julian, for this great discussion.